Coming to you live from Johannesburg over the next hour, an in-depth look at the big local, international and African stories that are shaping our world this evening. This is Tonight with Jane Dutton. Tonight, the dying days of Bosasa, dumped by the banks and now calling for voluntary liquidation. What happens to the 4,500 employees, and is shutting Bosasa down enough? Stripping her of her dignity and privacy, the barbaric targeting of Caster Semenya. She's at the Court of Arbitration in Switzerland right now, fighting for the right to be left alone and not to be forced to medicate to lower her prowess. Is this a case of bad losers or the right way forward? And we ask why only African sports stars are being targeted here. The cost of postponing Nigeria's elections to its reputation and balance sheet, a staggering $1.5 billion and counting. With 6 more days to the new vote, we explore the impact of the delay. Sentenced to 20 years in jail and yet retaining his post. Why is a convicted thief still calling the shots at the Independent Communications Authority? Ruben Moshalocha was found guilty of fraud and money laundering. Who or what is stopping him from being axed? But first, the news. 10 years after claims around Bosasa bribery first emerged, it's finally closing down. The company, now known as African Global Operations, is applying for voluntary liquidation. And that's after FNB and ABSA officials announced they would be closing the company's bank accounts. It leaves its biggest client, Correctional Services, in a fix. The department has now set up a war room to deal with what could become a crisis. Governor Whittles takes a look.
In 2009, an SIU report uncovers how Bosasa allegedly bribed Correctional Services Commissioner Linda Mti for catering and security contracts. But nothing happens. 10 years on, the company has a different name. It makes headlines again when former COO Angelo Agrizi tells the State Capture Commission the SIU was spot on. Just a week later, the hawks swoop on Agrizi and other Bosasa officials. And on Monday, the company submits its voluntary liquidation application to the High Court after being notified banks will close its accounts. Several government departments are now uncertain about the future of their contracts with the controversial firm. Correctional Services is setting up a war room to deal with the fallout of the liquidation, which will affect 46,000 inmates at 7 facilities. But it's not the only department looking at its contracts with African Global Operations.
I have asked the Ethics Council to review any business that the provincial government has ever done with Bosasa.
Police and Prisons Union POPCRU is welcoming the closure of Bosasa's accounts.
The disintegration of facilities is one of the issues that has actually happened, because I think even when you look at the services they provided, there's nothing substantial to actually show that there was work done.
African Global Operations spokesperson Papa Leshabane is refusing to comment on the impact of the company's downfall. Governor Whittles, Johannesburg.
So for more on this, we speak to Kaz Kavadia, CEO of the Banking Association of South Africa. A very warm welcome to you, Kaz Kavadia. Why do you think the banks took this action? Did they have any alternative?
Well, I don't have any details of why they took action against this particular company, because that would be confidential interactions between the bank and the client and the regulators. But speaking generally, banks would, Bosasa obviously has been in the news. The Financial Intelligence Center office would have taken an interest in it. Banks would have looked closely at their account. And if banks are obliged by law, if they pick up suspicious activity going through an account to then report that to the Financial Intelligence Center office.
And would they at the same time
happened.
be weighing up reputational damage here, potential damage?
Well, it's not only reputational damage. There's legislation and regulation that makes it incumbent upon banks to report suspicious activity going through an account. If they don't do that, there's substantial downside for them from a regulatory point of view. So there's a reputational damage, that's the one thing, but there's also legislation that says that if they pick up suspicious activity, they've got to report it.
Okay.
And then there'd be an interaction between the bank and the Financial Intelligence Center office, and that interaction in this case resulted in the account being closed.
What impact will this have on Bosasa? Obviously, they don't have access to money coming in and going out. And how does the liquidation process work in the light of all of this?
Well, they've put themselves under voluntary liquidation. That process must now unfold. There's questions about, obviously, what happens to the money and so on. Again, I don't know the specifics of this, but if there was money in the account, the authorities might have decided to freeze that money or taken some other decisions. But the liquidation process must now take its course, and in that process, both creditors and employees must be treated as fairly as possible under the circumstances. I don't know what the financial state of the company is. I don't know whether...
Yes, I was going to ask you that. I mean, do they look at what can still be salvaged now, or is that still too early?
Well, as part of the liquidation process, they would look at what can be salvaged.
Yeah, and the impact on the bank there. How does this... how similar is this to what we saw with the Guptas?
Well, again, the banks closed the Oak Bay accounts, and again, I can't talk about similarities except from what's in the public space, because I have no information, and I should not have information even about the Oak Bay accounts because of confidentiality issues between banks and the clients. But if one just takes this from a public point of view and what we see in the public space, it seems fairly obvious that both in the Oak Bay case and this case, businesses were run in an unethical manner. It seems that accounts were used to actually possibly launder money or other nefarious activities. If you listen to the Agrisi evidence, quite clear that a lot of cash went through without being recorded. So there seem to be similar issues. As I said, I don't have any details about this, but just presumptions from the public debate around these things. There seem to be some similarity.
Okay, let me ask you this, and briefly, if you will, how different is this to, everyday occurrences at the bank? People, individuals, going through the same sort of treatment?
Well, banks close accounts
every day.
Not necessarily every day, but they do close accounts, and for various reasons. Again, those would be between the bank and the clients. But the Oak Bay and Bosasa have become were in the public space because of the extent of the alleged corruption that happened in those two businesses, and so this came out in the public space, and banks had to announce that they're closing the accounts. But in the normal course of business, for various reasons, banks close accounts, and there are processes to do that. There's regulation that govern that, and they would do that according to process and regulation.
Okay, let's leave it there, Kaz.
Okay.
Thanks for sharing your experience with us. Former Treasury DG Lungisa Fuzile says former President Jacob Zuma and others were not happy with the Finance Ministry. Lungisa says his team caused discontent when it questioned projects such as nuclear procurement. He's been testifying at the State Capture Inquiry.
We were insisting on thorough processes. Of course, I would submit that for some of these it would seem that people had other interests other than what is supposed to just inform how you approach these kinds of decisions.
Athletics South Africa is accusing the International Association of Athletics Federations of underhanded tactics. The IAAF has released the names of their expert witnesses and their views on the topics to be covered at Caster Semenya's Court of Arbitration case. ASA says it's shocked and disappointed by the breach of confidentiality. Semenya is challenging the IAAF's proposed new regulations on testosterone levels in female athletes. The new regulations will force her to take drugs to lower her testosterone. The Court of Arbitration for Sport says the case is unusual and unprecedented.
For the week, it's a succession of evidence, witness experts with closing submissions on the last day, on Friday. Hopefully the panel will be able to conclude the hearing by Friday night. And then there will be about 4 weeks deliberations between the panel members, and a final award, a final decision will be issued in writing and will be announced publicly. It's unusual and unprecedented, as I said, because we never had such a case at CAS. What's going to happen, I'm not able to say, but it will be important for sure, yes.
Parents and teachers at a school in Cape Town fear a repeat of the deadly Hoërskool Driehoek tragedy. Children at Pinedene Primary are now being taught under trees because their school appears to be unsafe. Staff made the decision last month, claiming several calls to the Western Cape Education Department are being ignored. Leanne Johnson has more.
Remember, problem solving.
These pupils have a huge problem that needs solving, and it has nothing to do with their maths lesson. Half of Pinedene Primary School's children are being taught outside, mainly under trees. At a glance, the building does appear unsafe. Safety railings are loose. Walls are mouldy, and the building is filled with asbestos.
We have a building here at our school which is more than 50 years old. The building is falling apart, there's cracks that is right through the thing. See, so the same thing like Driehoek, it's going to happen here.
So for now, around 600 children are forced to brave the elements, gang violence and noise to get through their lessons. Parents want to remain anonymous, but they're visibly fuming.
It's children, they run up and down. What if that thing collapses on top of the other 160 or 100 children that's at the bottom, in the bottom classes? It's not a good thing. And I mean, what are we going to get? We're only just going to get rest in peace to the kids or condolences to the families.
The Western Cape Education Department denies the building poses a danger, but it admits asbestos is present at the school and says the inappropriate building materials used will be addressed over the next 10 years. This is cold comfort for those affected, who are now calling on Basic Education Minister Angie Motshekga to take action. Leanne Jansen, Cape Town.
And we hear from our Director General of Sport and Recreation on the Caster Semenya saga after this.